It's such an honor to be with you, sir, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. You are the chairman of the Institute for Political Economy here in the United States. You are a former Wall Street editor and an author of many, many books. In Europe, we love you because you have a perspective that many do not have, as you speak in broad manners about the important issues of foreign policy and the state of the American culture today. You have also been awarded outstanding contributions here in the United States for your contribution to the development of the U.S. economical policy, and we're so thrilled and honored to be with you. You've spoken a great deal about the development of the American culture, and you've said actually that the identity politics in America has destroyed the nation and has created a situation where everything is deteriorating into hate speech, one group against the other. What do you mean by that?
You cannot have a diversity population when you teach hatred of the various components. Now, what happened in the United States was that the liberal class, the progressive class, the left-wing class, they ceased to represent the working class. And in place of standing up for the working class against the capitalist exploiter, the employer, they created a new victim group and a new exploiter. And the new exploiter is the white heterosexual male. And the new victim class is everyone else. It's the women, it's the homosexuals, it's the blacks, the Hispanics, transgendered, anybody but a white heterosexual male. So the whole notion of class conflict has been replaced by gender conflict, race conflict, sexual preference conflict. So that we now have a situation in which you have new forms of diversity, and such as homosexuals, straight, gender differences, racial differences, and these have taken the place of the class difference. And so the whole thing has been turned around. And so with the new victim group being white heterosexual males who are defenseless, they are not protected by quotas. They are not protected by prohibitions against hate speech or hate crimes. You can say anything about a white heterosexual male, which is peculiar if they are actually the dominant group. But you can't say the slightest thing about a black or a homosexual or a woman. So this has the population at each other's throats, whereas it used to be the capitalist and the worker, and now it's everybody against everybody. And yet we have more and more diversity. So this is not a framework for a peaceful society. It's not a framework for a society that can come together and deal with common problems. And it's not a society that can exercise constraint over its government because it's split. It's not united. And therefore, it's very easy for very powerful interest groups to dominate and it becomes almost impossible to constrain the powers of government. For example, in the 21st century, which is still a new century, the Bill of Rights has been stripped out of the Constitution. The George W. Bush administration declared that the president, on his own authority, had the right to arrest and detain American citizens indefinitely without a warrant, without presentation of evidence to a court. In other words, the president said he had the powers of a medieval baron to pick up somebody and throw them in a dungeon and keep them there. Then we had, with the Obama administration, the president declared he had the power to kill American citizens without due process of law, and exercised this power on some Islamic American citizens who he said were supporting terrorism, and murdered them with missiles shot from drones. Well, this is a claim that citizens can be executed without due process of law. It was on suspicion alone. There was no indictment, no presentation of evidence, no court, no conviction. It was just execution. Well, these are totally prohibited by the United States Constitution. We've also had the development of mass surveillance, mass spying, mass interception of personal communications without warrants. This is also strictly unconstitutional. It's now written in law. We actually have laws. And in fact, just recently, the Congress renewed the law, and President Trump signed it, that the National Security Administration can spy on whoever it wants without any warrant, without going to a court, without presenting evidence why this needs to be done, so that we have massive surveillance, not just of Americans, but of the whole world. You may remember there was the issue of the NSA intercepting the Chancellor of Germany's personal cell phone calls. So those are three big examples of how civil liberty, which is the basis for the United States, has been destroyed in the 21st century, all on the basis of protecting us against terrorism. But of course, when there are no constraints on government, you're not protected. The government, with those kinds of powers, is a much greater threat to people than terrorists. And so this shows an extraordinary collapse, because when the differences were class, there was a milieu, an atmosphere for reforms. You could say, okay, we've got to do more for the underdogs, the ones who are carrying the brunt. And so they brought in Social Security, they brought in Medicare, they tried to do things that help the down and out. But when you no longer have these class distinctions, what reforms do you bring in when you have this identity politics where every group has its own separate interest? There's no basis for any kind of reform. How do you reform it? the way identity politics says you reform it is you get rid of white people. There was recently an article published in a Texas University student newspaper that says white DNA is an abomination. Well, in this type of attitude, there's no basis for goodwill, for some compromise, some kind of common ground. The old class distinctions, unless you were a strict Marxist, you did have grounds for goodwill, for compromise. And so they had reforms that people didn't have to fight for, literally fight. The ruling class would say, yes, we agree to this. There was a basis for goodwill. In identity politics, there's no basis for goodwill.
It's such a paradox because in Europe and in the whole world actually, we used to look up to America as a melting pot based on national identity, regardless of creed and race. And it's precisely that. The ability for poor people from India or Pakistan or Ireland and Norway were able to travel to the great Americas where class distinction wasn't as strong as in the old regime. And we were able to make it here, even though we were poor in our countries of origin. So that's the paradox we see today, how America is falling for precise the same trap of using ethnicity as a distinction of how to state what is good and what is wrong and what is right. That's such a paradox to us.
Yes, and it's even more of a paradox because it's the ruling ethnicity that's on the defensive. It's under attack. And so it's not a hopeful situation.
Thank you very much. We are so honored to have spoken to you.
Well, thank you very much for including me in your wonderful programs.